Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be asking what should the Christian response be to the new Israeli government led by Benjamin Netanyahu. Warm welcome to the programme, and today's special guest is all the way from Oxford. His name is Len Grates. He's a good friend of mine, and we do a programme together called Jerusalem Dispatch ICJ UK. Len, it's great to have you back on the Middle East Report, particularly as we unpack this kind of very difficult subject that needs to be addressed, and that should be what is the Christian response to this new Israeli government that needs to be addressed. But before we do that, do you want to give us an update on the wonderful work that you do and ICJ UK do in supporting Israel and the Jewish people?
Yes, thanks, Simon. It's fantastic to be back with you. You do an amazing job with this programme every week, and God bless you for doing it. The International Christian Embassy is always busy, even though it's been a quiet winter with regards to activities. There's always lots going on in Israel that we're constantly financially supporting and prayerfully supporting. I think one of the highlights of the last couple of months, just recently we had the Envision conference, which was the leaders conference where we invite leaders from right around the world to come and really have an experience of Israel. We sponsored 9 leaders from the UK to go. This is 9 church leaders. And I think all of those, or maybe one, had never really experienced the truth and teachings of Israel. And I think under the ministry of Jürgen Buhler, our international director, our president, and Peter Suki here and Malcolm Heading, some amazing teaching, they had their eyes opened. And they've really got on board and they're saying, you know, how can we get involved more? And so we're really thrilled about that. You know, it's one thing to get 1 or 2 additional supporters coming to help us, but when you get leaders who can influence their congregations and influence other leaders, then that's a very, very special thing. So we're thankful to the Lord for that, and we're thankful for the Lord to provide for us, because we, as I say, we were able to sponsor the majority of the costs for each of these leaders, and that's through to the generosity of the supporters of ICJ, for which we're always very, very grateful.
Amazing. And also, just a reminder to our viewers, you can watch Jerusalem Dispatch ICJ UK the first Monday of every month between 7 and 8, a programme you don't want to miss. Right, coming back to today's issue, I mean, the discussion on the new Israeli government that was in place almost at the end of December 2022, going into January of 2023, we see that Benjamin Netanyahu has come back for a 6th term as the Israeli Prime Minister, the longest serving Israeli Prime Minister in history, and he probably has to go down as the most successful Israeli politician of all time. But he's put together the most religious and right-wing coalition in the history of any Israeli coalition government, and it's considered extremely controversial in Israel and also amongst the diaspora of the Jewish communities around the world. What are your thoughts on this new controversial government in Israel?
Well, obviously Benjamin Netanyahu is a proven leader. He's been there for so long. He's dealt with so many crises of various shapes and sizes, internationally, locally, nationally as well. And unfortunately, because of the style of government that Israel has, it's a government of compromise always, because it's a coalition. But unfortunately, on this occasion, it's had to compromise even further, particularly with the right-wing religious parties, who surprisingly got a large number of votes. And of course, now he's saying that, well, he's got a mandate to do stuff. And so he's functioning along that line of saying, well, I'm only doing what the people voted me in to do. And of course, that's quite controversial because he's gone further to the right in order to, in my opinion, to appease the right-wing religious parties. Absolutely. Who he's had to make a deal with, and he's had to bring in some of the most extreme, if I can call them that, political views on the right-wing religious side in order to form a government. This is unfortunately the fruit of coalition governments. You know, I personally don't think it's a very good model for government. But you know, Simon, just as I want to throw in right at the very beginning here, so that you know our viewers understand, I personally believe that there'll always be confusion and chaos in Israeli politics because God instituted Israel, brought Israel to birth. You know, he's his first son, and his intention was it to be ruled under a king. It's a kingdom of Israel. And so there'll never be peace, there'll never be a true peace in the political realm until the true king comes and takes his rightful position. But in the meantime, you know, we have to deal with this imperfect and flawed government who unfortunately are dictated to by other forces rather than just their own personal convictions.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a clear contrast between the previous coalition government that was led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, which was very much of a secular Israeli government, which particularly under Yair Lapid gravitated to Biden and the Biden administration in the US. And yet today we have a very conservative, a very ultra-religious nationalists coalition in place. The likes of the Shas party involved as well, and Smotrich, and also Itamar Ben Gvir. So how do you think ordinary Israelis are kind of responding to this current government? Because, you know, with a coalition government, you always don't get what you actually kind of voted for. And that's the problem. People wanted a strong right-wing government in Israel, but I don't think they wanted this kind of government.
Yeah, it's too way to the right in many people's opinion, and unfortunately, when you get extreme governmental positions, you get divides in the whole population because there's a stronger reaction to more extreme wings, whether left or right, and that's when you find people coming out onto the streets. Like they've had 100,000 people on the streets every Sunday night for the past couple of months, protesting against the new government's plans to reform the judicial system in Israel. So what we're seeing is people have become much more aware of politics, and it's causing divisions. Bigger divisions than there ever has been, and that's a very, very sad thing to see. But, you know, if one country needs to be united, it's this small country, you know, of 6-7 million Jewish people, 2 or 3 million Arabs. You know, the size of Wales. It needs to be united, and it's a very, very sad thing to observe and watch that there is a growing division, and I can only see that getting worse. And you know, I've read words such as civil war, which concerns me. You know, some I don't know whether it's journalists just whipping their own stories up, but to see that term in the Israeli press with regards to Israel, I don't think there would be a physical civil war, but underneath there is this civil conflict that's going on with the people, and that's very, very sad to see.
Absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of when the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu won a sixth term and actually put his coalition government together.
Amid raucous heckling, Benjamin Netanyahu presented the goals of his incoming government. Among them, prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and continue to seek peace agreements with Israel's Arab neighbors.
Knesset members, I don't need to hear your yelling to know that we have certain disagreements. I'll say one thing, we do have a wide agreement between us on most of the tasks and challenges before us.
It took months of campaigning, followed by 8 more weeks of bargaining to reach this day.
Opposition and Knesset members, losing elections isn't the end of democracy. It's the essence of democracy.
Netanyahu's Likud party issued a statement Wednesday that the new coalition would, quote, advance and develop settlement in all parts of the land of Israel, in the Galilee, Negev, Golan Heights, and Judea and Samaria.
Well, I think it's good that the coalition platform is created from the beginning and everybody understands what this government stands for, which is very much in line with what the voters who voted for this right-wing government stand for.
Much of the world considers the West Bank settlements illegal. Although more than 500,000 Jews live there, the United States has often constrained Israeli expansion there.
Particularly with regard to settlements in previous administrations in the United States, Netanyahu was forced actually to limit building in the settlements of Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, which is commonly known as the West Bank. And Israel, as Netanyahu said and the coalition agreement says, has exclusive rights to all the land within the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria.
Voters, however, supported this government in part to promote such an expansion and also to stop the growth of Palestinian violence.
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think, first of all, we need to realize that the government that has been formed has been chosen in a democratic system by the majority of the people of Israel who wanted to see a change from the previous government.
Outgoing government members are unhappy with certain policy changes and appointments, including Itamar Gvir as the new Minister for National Security. Oded Ravivi, mayor of Efrat, a Jewish community in Judea and Samaria, says the incoming government is already tempering its stand.
I think people need to remember, in a nutshell, that politicians, they campaign for their base, but they govern for the people. And once they sit on the chair of the minister or of the chair of power, they understand that there are limits to the power, and there is also some compromises that need to be made in order to actually move forward.
The new government could also benefit from sustained media attacks and foreign criticism. The expectations have been set so low that any advances toward peace or security may be well received by the public. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
A very good report there by CBN. And Len, there are many Christian supporters of Israel who welcome this new government. They recognise that this new government strongly fights the cause of the Jewish settlers in the biblical heartland of Israel, known as Judea and Samaria. They also welcome this government's tougher stance on Palestinian terrorism and tougher stance on security. But share with us your concerns regarding the plight of the Christians and the Messianic Jewish communities in Israel with this new religious government.
I think it could be said that Netanyahu is a favourite of the Christian community outside of Israel. Internationally, he is generally accepted as being very sympathetic to the Christian message and the Christian cause. But within Israel, even the Messianic communities are quite divided this time. They feel as if Benjamin Netanyahu has moved the goalposts to when he was previously Prime Minister. And of course, him bringing in these anti-Christian leaders, anti-Messianic community leaders, that has caused a big concern within the Messianic community itself. You know, they've always had opposition. There's always been movements against the Messianic congregations around the country. There's been activists who have been disturbing meetings, disturbing congregations. But I can only see that that's only going to get worse under the present government, because there is this, it's now spoken from government that some of the leaders, some of these key leaders, are not very sympathetic at all to the Christian movement, and certainly not, they're very much against the Messianic movement in the land.
Yeah, because one major concern in previous years is when religious parties have played a major role, and also particularly running the kind of ministries like the Ministry of the Interior or the equivalent of the Home Office here in the UK, is that they've made life very, very difficult for Messianics or even Christian organisations as well that are working out of Israel, that are bringing their workers in who love Israel, they stand with Israel, they fight and contend for Israel, have found life very, very difficult when the religious parties, elements control the Ministry of the Interior and also the Education Ministry as well.
Yeah. Well, as you rightfully point out, the Ministry of Interior, that really is the ministry, the office that goes through and approves anyone making aliyah, has really closed the door to any believers in Yeshua making aliyah, even though they may be Jewish. And so these ministries, these public ministries under the likes of the Shas Party and Ari Deri, who are very anti-Messianic movement, very anti-Christian, they have made it almost impossible for any believing Jewish person, any believing in Yeshua, in Jesus, to go and live in Israel. So they've closed the door to a whole section of the Jewish community worldwide who would like to go and make aliyah, make home, move to Israel. So these are big concerns, and that is now going to get worse. And even they're talking about trying to reverse decisions that had previously been made over Messianic people to try and expel them out of the country. Now, I don't think they'll be able to do that because I think that the courts would not allow it. It would be really going against the whole principle of law and decision making. So there's huge concern, definitely huge concern. But at the same time, there are those who say, yes, we need to get behind this government because they're wanting to expand the biblical mandate over the land, particularly over Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland, bringing that under, annexed by Israel to become part of the nation of Israel. So there are some very controversial things that are possibly going to happen, are happening already, actually, that are causes for concern, for prayer.
And it's also important to note as well that Messianic Jewish people living in the land of Israel serve in the IDF. And many of them have reached high-ranking positions within the Israeli Defense Force, and that they have committed their lives to defending the state of Israel. And you would have thought that the government authorities would recognise that these are very good citizens, they're very patriotic, they're very hardworking, they're very loyal, and on the question of what every Israeli asks of each other, they serve in the Israeli Defense Force. Shouldn't that just give them the credibility and the authority to realise, yes, they are Jewish, they are full citizens of Israel, and they've even volunteered to be part of the Israeli Defense Force in order to protect the nation, and would risk their lives if Israel was involved in another war?
Well, I personally know a number of young people who are present, today in the Israeli army, serving in some very difficult situations. They're children of believing families, and these families have not withheld their kids from joining the army, encouraged them to say, listen, it's all part of being initiated into Israeli culture and identifying it with the Jewish people. And so I've not come across any believing teenagers who have said, no, I don't want to go into the army. They've all said they're looking forward to going into the army. But what we're seeing is an idealism coming about that is going to really affect how these Messianic believers are viewed. It's interesting that in the army, as you've rightly pointed out, Simon, that they are highly regarded. They're very, very good soldiers. In fact, that one unit actually took the new recruits along to a congregation that I'm connected with. And one of the leaders from the congregation spoke to these new recruits about what Messianic Judaism really is. Because there were so many of these people coming into the army and playing their part. So within the army itself, I think these new recruits, these Messianic believers, have actually brought a great name upon the movement because they've served exceptionally well.
Amazing, because that's how you get acceptance in Israeli society, by volunteering
Absolutely.
with the Israeli Defense Force and doing your time, whilst like some of the other extreme elements within this, people within this new government haven't served in the Israeli Defense Force. They haven't put their life on the line defending the state, and maybe that needs to be raised in their defense. But talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, I mean, he is, as I mentioned earlier in the program, he is Israel's most successful prime minister, longest serving prime Prime Minister. He's now in his 6th term. As Prime Minister, he's extraordinary. He's the most gifted politician of his generation. We have to credit him with achievements which have been absolutely remarkable, such as transforming the Israeli economy. And Israel now is the 4th largest economy in the world, with billions and billions being invested in Israel's high-tech and startup nation. And he's played a major role in doing that. He's protected and slimlined the IDF, so it's more efficient. It's not so reliant upon the government and the Israeli people to pay for the IDF. He's also then, of course, famous for his Abraham Accords and making peace with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Sudan, and he's one of the key architects in creating peace. He's also stood up to President Obama over the Iranian nuclear threat, and he's been responsible for protecting Israel and delaying Iran's development of nuclear weapons. He's also stood up to terrorism around the world, and he's been the kind of strongest supporter of Christian evangelicals than any other previous Israeli Prime Minister. So he deserves a lot of credit, but I'm also concerned now that also maybe he stayed in office for too long, and because of this new coalition he's brought into government could actually taint his legacy. And there is concern that he hasn't prepared a successor to lead the Likud party, his party of government. And the reason why we've had so much political impasse over the last few years is because he's not great at working people. He's a brilliant visionary, but he's not very good at keeping his coalition partners on board. And this probably explains why Israel's in the political mess that she's in.
Yeah, you know, he's been a brilliant leader for Israel, although he's controversial, and because he's right-wing, you'll always have those on the left wing who will disagree with him. That's normal politics. But there's something changed in this present government that concerns me. In the past, I've always admired him to be a man that owned himself, and he was confident in himself and portrayed him. He came across very confident. This time, I feel as if he's had to allow himself to be stringed up a little bit by these more extreme parties that he's signed up deals with. He's become a little bit of a puppet to them. So there's things that he once said openly, positive things particularly about the Christian community, which I think we will see in the months to come. He's much more guarded on what he says with regards to anything Christian for that matter. So there are those pulling strings on him, and he's lost that uniqueness of being a strong, independent leader. He's now a leader that has got others controlling him in certain areas, and that is a sign of weakness, and that will inevitably bring about a downfall. There's already splits in the Likud party over things that are happening right now, and of course we must also remember that he is having to face a court case. Which he is trying to get a way out of, and that's not righteous. And that's the same for other members in his government now who hold criminal records. Just this week, in fact, it's today. I don't know when this is going to be recorded. For those who are watching, it's happening this day. That the government are making. A vote on the dairy bill. You know, it's called the dairy bill, which would allow Aryeh Deri, who was disqualified from politics because he was a convicted criminal, but this bill would allow him to come back in and take office, and also allow Netanyahu to sneak under the radar from his legal proceedings, and the same for others as well. So there are things happening in this government that are not righteous. And it's righteousness that exalts a nation. Unrighteousness will inevitably cause its downfall. And I fear that this, even though it's a strong government numerically, I fear that it won't be a long-lasting government.
No, interesting to get your perspective on that one as well, Len. But what do you make of the political success of the religious Zionist parties as they're described at the last general election in Israel? The likes of Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Gvir playing major roles within this new government. Itamar Gvir is the he's the national security minister, and Smotrich is the minister for finance. I mean, these are major positions in the government, and considering that they have been branded by the Israeli press and even those in Israel's security forces known as the Shin Bet as kind of extremists with extremist past. This is a bit troubling.
It is a bit troubling, and the concerning aspect to this is that these people were actually voted into position. So there's a movement, there's a shift taking place within Israeli society that's causing people to say, well, I'm tired of this system, and I'm tired of this way. These guys seem to be, particularly in addressing terrorism and issues in the West Bank and Gaza, these are hard reactive leaders to those situations. And I think that there is that ingredient in this mix that we have in the government today that is a sign of concern amongst the people in the Israeli society who want to see strong leadership, in particularly against radical Palestinians, which we've seen an increase in recent weeks. It's very disconcerting. Unfortunately, they want to use violence, but violence produces violence. If they're too strong with the Palestinians are not going to sit back and just let the Israelis walk over them. There's going to be a reaction, and we need to be really praying into that as Christians, that the spiritual forces that are behind all this are subdued somehow or other. And it's not through political moves here. It's not a chess game trying to win. There are forces that we need to be praying into. So I'm concerned that within Israeli society there's been a shift in order to put these people into power. And of course it indicates that there is a stronger religious segment to Israeli society than maybe there was in 10 years ago. So there's all sorts of things that this government is indicative of that we need to be seriously praying into.
And also, do you think a lot of this is being triggered by the violence that we saw in May of 2021, when we saw the violence in Jerusalem, the Temple Mount? We saw very dangerous riots in Jerusalem, but we also saw, really for the first time since the Second Intifada of 2000, Israeli Arabs who have been given incredible rights under Israel. They can vote. They are full citizens. They have freedom to travel anywhere they want around the country. They are considered the most free of all the Arabs in the entire Middle East. And yet they attacked their Jewish neighbors as well, which has caused great alarm and unrest in Israel, knowing that there are elements within Israeli Arab society that are being radicalized into extreme Islam. And instead of before, when it was Palestinians coming over the border to attack Israel on terrorist attacks, we're now seeing that Israel is producing homegrown terrorists, which is altogether a more challenging and difficult trend that Israel has to deal with.
So that's very true, but I think also it's a truth that it's an overflow of what's happening in the West Bank. That it's overflowed into Israel itself, and there are those sympathizers amongst the Arab community who sympathize greatly with the Palestinian cause of independence. I've met Arabs in Israel who are very pro-Israel. And who fought in the Israeli army as Arabs, Israeli Arabs, and who are genuinely Israeli. They're not Jewish or Arab. They say, I'm an Israeli. So, but there are those also I've met who really would love to see the downfall of Israel, and who identify completely with this destructive element within the Palestinian ideology that says, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. This getting rid of the Jews, the hatred of the Jews. And unfortunately, that's rising. And, the stronger the arm of the police and the army, the more radical, unfortunately, these Palestinians will become. And again, it's, one thing these politicians really do need is wisdom and grace to know how to handle human beings, not just ideological people from the West Bank, but to great wisdom to know how to handle these. Sometimes it needs a strong arm, but sometimes it needs an open hand. And we need to pray that that these leaders will know the difference as how to react and how to respond in different situations.
Absolutely, and we also have to do our research as well, and that's an important part of this programme to realise the makeup of the new Israeli government. For example, the Finance Minister Smotrich is now the Minister of Finance, is considered an ultra-nationalist and leads the religious hardline National Union Party. This is according to the Times of Israel. He was arrested by Shin Bet division for suspected Jewish terrorism during the disengagement from Gaza, shortly before the August 2005 operation to move Jewish settlers from 21 settlements in the Gaza Strip and 4 more in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. So Smotrich and 4 other activists were detained and found to be in possession of 700 litres of gasoline and oil. And, should they be barred from Israel, from office? It goes on also to say what they're like. So according to Moti Yogev, who's a former Jewish Home member of the Knesset, describes Smotrich as an ideologue first and foremost, calling his right-wing nationalism and conservative religious ideology the religious Zionist leader's primary driving force. His desire to strengthen the Jewish people to retain Judea and Samaria and to strengthen religious values are what constitute his core values, said by this former member of Knesset. What would you say that really the dilemmas of having someone in office that is very ideologically driven rather than politically progressive in terms of, doing what's best for the country, but more focusing on this kind of very zealous religious, what many describe as religious extremists. And I can't really mention what he said at some of the progressive marches seen in Jerusalem as well.
Well, personally, I feel that anyone that has a criminal record for such things should be barred from political office. If this were to happen in other countries, it would be front page headlines. It wouldn't be allowed in this country. Anyone with a criminal record is barred from holding political office. And the fact that Israel is allowing at least 2, maybe more, people who have criminal records to be in key positions in the government is not a very good statement to the international community, never mind their own people. And there are better people out there to be leaders that should be getting involved. Why do we need to have ex-prisoners as leaders of very key national departments running the country in order to support a prime minister who wants to be prime minister and wants to stay in power? There's something radically wrong here. And so it's deeply concerning. And I think it would be that anyone that has any ounce of common sense almost would say the same. It's concerning when you have such people in such positions and who are telling the nation how to run. So we need to get on our knees a lot more, I think, for the nation of Israel.
And definitely also what's alarming is that Smotrich has also expressed a stated ultimate ambition for the state of Israel to be turned into a Torah theocracy. And in 2019, he told stewards the Mekaz Harav Yeshiva in Jerusalem that his party wants the justice portfolio because he wants to restore the Torah justice system. So what do you think that will mean for ordinary secular Israelis, Christian Israelis, and also some of the Israeli Arab minorities who are extremely loyal to the state of Israel, such as the Jews, such as the Bedouin, and also Christian Arabs as well, that all serve in the IDF and all consider themselves Israelis, would find it very, very difficult to live under a kind of Torah theocracy?
Well, it'd be interesting to see how he did that, wouldn't it? Would he bring back the 613 laws of Moses in order to make, is that the law of the land now? Get rid of all the other laws, just have the law of Moses? So I don't really know what he really means by that, but I guess what he is saying is that he's trying to restore his vision of what Judaism is. Unfortunately, these guys in office, they are ignorant in some areas. They might know some stuff, but unfortunately, I'm sorry, I might sound very critical here and very judgmental, but they are totally unaware of many things that the Bible talks about. And so, you know, if they want to bring in the religious Torah, there would be a mass exodus from the nation of Israel. Aliyah would be reversed. People would not go and want to be part of this Jewish state. I know they want to have their Jewishness reaffirmed and be part of a Jewish nation, but I can only see that it would be so destructive that I can't actually see it happening, even though he says things. You know, one thing about politicians, they say all sorts of things before they're voted into power, but when they're in power and accountable and see the opposition to some of the things they say, they have to moderate quite substantially in some cases. And I'm really hoping that this happens for these guys.
Some do and some don't. You know, talking about Benjamin Netanyahu, last December I was invited to be part of the Israeli government's press office and foreign ministry's Christian Media Summit, and we're supposed to be addressed by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He didn't address us, and then he was for the opening night, gala night, he didn't turn up. He was also supposed to address us in the Knesset. He didn't. So that was a kind of bit disappointing because we wanted to see him. And before, he's always been so supportive of Christian broadcasters and journalists. And also, I think that plays into the fact that the Trump administration is no longer occupying the White House, and we have a progressive liberals occupying the White House under President Biden. I think that's played a major role in this. But also the fact that we were actually addressed by Itamar Gvir, the very, very controversial National Security Minister, and he had a dark presence about him, very dark presence. He's also looked at his henchmen, and you've got to be worried. And the challenge I think Netanyahu has with him is that he doesn't represent a party, he represents a movement. And when you represent a movement, you can't moderate your views because otherwise you will lose your movement. If he then does everything that a normal politician would do and be a bit more progressive and change his views, I mean, this is a guy that is considered the most extreme individual in Israeli politics. He wasn't allowed to join the Israeli Defense Force because they couldn't trust him with a gun. And now he's Israel's national security minister. We've already seen that he's gone up onto the kind of Temple Mount, and Jews should be able to pray on the Temple Mount. I think that's essential in a democracy, that you have freedom of worship and freedom of prayer. But you know, with him, it's more antagonistic. He wants to antagonize. And I think he's the biggest challenge that Benjamin Netanyahu has to face. What are your thoughts on Itamar Ben-Gvir, the controversial National Security Minister?
Well, I'm very concerned about him as an individual and his views, but I'm pleased to say he's only one person in the government. And, you know, as strong as he may have, you know, look what happened in our own country with Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn. He was pushed out, even though he had strong views. People reacted against him, and ultimately it was his demise, and to the point that he's basically been kicked out of the Labour Party now. I suspect that will happen with him. This guy's going to make lots of noise, and he'll cause some problems for sure, and he'll pull some strings on Netanyahu for sure. But let's just remember, he's only one person, one individual, and that's my hope, that there are good people who will rise up. There are people with common sense. There are people with deeper concerns for the Israeli society than one person's own personal driven vision or convictions. So I'm discouraged in one sense in the fact that he's been allowed to come into government and have a department to rule over himself. But I'm encouraged that there are those that I think will balance him out, will hold him in place, that will force him into a corner and say, listen, it doesn't matter how loud you shout, we're not going to go the way you say.
Absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of some of the controversy caused by Itamar Ben-Gvir, especially as he visited recently the Temple Mount, which the United Nations should never have condemned Israel for. But we have to understand his motives of why he did this. Let's have a look.
Incoming National Security Minister Itamar Gvir sparked the meeting when he spent 13 minutes on the Temple Mount, the first visit by an Israeli minister in almost 5 years. During the emergency session in New York, the UN and a parade of nations, including the U.S., criticized Israel for the visit.
Secretary Blinken has said very clearly that it's absolutely critical for all sides to exercise restraint, refrain from provocative actions and rhetoric at the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount and other holy sites in Jerusalem, both in word and in practice. In this spirit, we oppose any and all unilateral actions that depart from the historic status quo, which are unacceptable.
Israel's ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, slammed the meeting and said he was shocked.
And why? Because there is absolutely no reason that this emergency session today should be held. None. To hold a Security Council session on a non-event is truly absurd. To claim that this brief and completely legitimate visit should spark an emergency Security Council session is pathetic. Security Council session on what?
Former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, served 5 years at the UN and told CBN News the Palestinian Authority was behind the emergency meeting.
It's part of the diplomatic terrorism of the Palestinian Authority. You know, they put pressure on the representatives in the Security Council to call for a meeting. They will come, spread lies. No, it's not helping the Palestinians. It's not helping the peace process. It's part of the blame game.
For his part, Itamar Gvir maintained his visit did not violate the status quo on the Temple Mount.
The Temple Mount is open to all. Muslims and Christians come up here, and yes, also Jews. In a government I'm a member of, there will be no discrimination, and Jews will come up and visit the Temple Mount.
After Gvir's visit to the Temple Mount behind me, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a statement saying that the status quo would not change. That's where Israeli police prevent anyone other than Muslims from praying on the Temple Mount out of fear of disturbances. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
And we all know that the Temple Mount is so hotly contested, and it just needs a little ignition and the whole region and Jerusalem goes up in flames. But we know that in any democracy that the Jewish people should have the right to pray on the Temple Mount. That is without question. They should be allowed to do that because this is the most holiest site in Judaism. However, you still have to be sensitive to situations that could inflame of violence and terrorism. And this is something that the Israeli government, I'm sure, are very much aware of. Len, it is difficult doing a program like this because all the programs that I've done on the Middle East Report over a decade, I've always been supportive of Israel, always been supportive of the Israeli government. There might be some policies that I disagree with, but I am concerned about this government. But I still believe as Christians that we continue to see Israel from a biblical perspective. We still continue to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and that we continue to show that unconditional love for Israel and the Jewish people, and to pray for this government, and pray that God's will would be done with this government, and that God would give wisdom to Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with this very, very difficult coalition. According to my notes here, for example, according to the New Yorker, Gvir is an ardent admirer of the racist known as Rabbi Meir Kahane, who advocated the transferring of Israel's Arab population out of the country. He was a teenage activist in Kahane's Kach movement and was convicted of incitement to racism in 2007 for holding a sign at a protest reading "Expel the Arab Enemy." He says he's modified Kahane's transfer demand and dodged a parliamentary ban by declaring he seeks to expel only the Arab Israeli citizens who he deems disloyal. Back in 2012, Gvir was the parliamentary researcher for MK Michael Ben-Ari, the National Union Party, who was given a New Testament, as were all other Knesset members, and he actually tore it up in what was seen as a kind of political stunt. And this is what is probably giving the Christian community great concern and alarm when they see someone who has probably moderated his rhetoric, but it's who he's associated with. And even the Israeli Defense Force couldn't trust him to be a soldier because they couldn't trust him with a gun. And he seems to be very much also involved in what is considered kind of Jewish extremism and terrorism.
Yeah. As you rightly point out, it could be very scary, particularly for the Arab community in the nation. But there's one advantage about holding position of high profile, in that you're far more accountable. And there would be pressures being exerted upon him from outside Israel as well as inside Israel that will hopefully hold him back from working out some of these things. Like I said earlier on, it's one thing to say something outside of politics. It's another thing to be able to put it into practice when you're in a position of authority. And so my hope and prayer is that being in that position, he's under the spotlight, as we just saw on this TV program. Being on the Temple Mount, he could have done that before he was in politics, and nobody would have thought, well, who's this guy, other than being a troublemaker. But now he's in a position of authority. He will be held to account. And of course, he's representing the people of Israel as an officer of the state of Israel. And so hopefully he will recognize that he's got to take the people of Israel with him in what he's planning to do. He can't do this on his own. Otherwise, and I hopefully this will be the case, he'll have a very short political career. Because he is a deceiver. He is a guy who works in the darkness, and that it all works to the downfall. People who do that always finish up losing their reputation, losing their jobs. They'll get kicked out. And I really hope and pray that Benjamin Netanyahu will rise to the occasion and be the leader that we know he can be, and say, listen, this far, no further. You can't go any further than this. You've made your point. Now let it rest, and hopefully, it won't turn out to be causing civil unrest in the nation, because that's what will happen. As I already mentioned, these marches, 100,000 each Sunday night in Tel Aviv, protesting against this government. It's a worrying situation, but I'm hopeful that it will be kept in order.
Absolutely, but we also need to kind of look at the bigger picture. I mean, this is happening internally within Israel, and I think we've discussed the kind of dilemmas facing this new Israeli coalition government, particularly the most right-wing and religious of any coalition government in Israel's history. But we have to look at the kind of external dangers that oppose Israel. I mean, we're seeing now multiple IDF counter-terrorism operations in Jenin, and the Palestinian Authority police have lost total control of Jenin, and we are seeing young residents of Jenin forming their own terrorist organizations that are independent of the likes of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or under the influence of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO, that are causing major terrorism threats to Israel, but obviously funded by the Iranians. We see that constant threat from Hamas with their rockets and missiles, as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We have 80 to 90,000 Iranian troops, militias up in Syria on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah being supplied to something in the region of 140 to 160,000 rockets and missiles aimed at Israel. We see that the Iranian regime has increased the centrifuge of its nuclear weapons production, has now reached 80%, which means they're very, very close to nuclear breakout. And we know that this regime has threatened to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. We also see that Israel, sadly, doesn't have so many allies in the West anymore. And we see that it's a much closer relationship between Biden and this current and the Israeli government than it was under President Obama, but it's still a difficult relationship with the United States. So as Christians, how should we respond to the challenges that Israel face, but at the same time loving and standing with Israel and the Jewish people? Because it's sometimes a difficult balance, like it is now.
Yeah, it is, Simon. I'm actually more concerned about his external threats than internal threats. And although the personalities we've been chatting about will have some influence in society, we must never take our eyes presently off Iran and what they're planning to do. Just in the news this recently, they had a ballistic missile, and on the side of it, written in Hebrew, was "Death to Israel." And you just know we're getting nearer and nearer and nearer to a possible confrontation with Iran, and we need to be praying into that. And but in order to do that, to be an effective society, they've got to be not as divided. What does the Bible say? A house divided against itself, how can it stand? So, although there may be wide divisions in the society of Israel, we've got to pray that they will be unified in fighting this outside force that could possibly, we don't know what will happen. The threat is there every day from Iran and also from Netanyahu. He's saying that thus far, no further. I think we've passed that red line so many times. I don't know how far he's going to go before he has to do something. I know Israel is constantly attacking Iranian targets in Syria, and it's only a matter of time before they start doing something in Iran themselves. They will not sit back and be a sitting duck for the Iranian regime.
No, absolutely, and with Netanyahu at the helm, there's a strong likelihood that he will take preemptive measures, and this is why we need to keep him in our prayers. But as Christians, how do we respond to the challenge of this new Israeli government? Maybe it's not to our liking, but we still love Israel. We should still support the Jewish state and the Jewish people. I think it's absolutely vital, and that we are actually commanded to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and we are told to comfort ye my people in Jerusalem as well. So as Christians, how should we respond to what is a kind of challenging political situation in Israel? But of course, many people feel like that. So it's getting that right balance, I think.
Well, as you previously mentioned, Simon, our mandate has not changed. We pray for Israel. We love Israel, not because we've got a sentimental attachment to them or think that they're any better than anybody else. We do it simply because the Bible says so, and God has given us a heart to love the Jewish people. That has not changed. And if anything, it should have changed in saying we're going to pray more for the survival of Israel, against themselves and against external factors. So, our mandate has always been biblical, and it's not dictated to by who's in power, who's not in power, whether we like them or not, whether we approve of what they say or whether we don't approve of what they say. Our calling as believers is to do exactly what the Bible says. Comfort ye my people. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Stand with them. During this time, we're remembering the feast of Purim in this season. We need to be those who stand up and be counted, as Queen Esther did for her people, and we need to be a voice for them and stand up, particularly before the throne of grace, praying for them. God loves to hear the prayer for his people, and if there's one thing he's going to do is answer the prayer that all Israel will be saved.
Absolutely, and we also have to put this in perspective as well. I mean, we've got our own government that is pretty much hated right now, and it lacks political legitimacy. We know that in the States with the Biden administration as well, I don't think there are any kind of Western governments in power right now that you can actually say are kind of righteous in any way. So instead of, we need to just not so much single Israel out, but say, is this not a kind of product of kind of wider society, the direction in which the world is going, and in which we're seeing huge ideological differences in our day, that people have less tolerance for each other, and we're seeing kind of extreme ideologies come to the fore because people have rejected kind of mainstream politics because they say, well, it doesn't deliver for us, so let's turn to the extreme. Within 30 seconds.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. If you look at France, there's huge protests there's growing protests in this country about all sorts of things, from climate change to all sorts of local plans for making small cities, small towns. You know, there is a great dissatisfaction that there is within many societies in America, as you say, in Western Europe, in in the EU. The things happening today. I read the paper every day and think, wow, what's going to happen next? It's just we're living in such uncertain times. So the great thing is that that the Lord is in charge. He's the sovereign King, and He's on our side.
Len, it's great to have you on today's edition of the Middle East Report. You've done a great job, and we needed to have this conversation and discussion today, and you're the perfect person to do that. So thank you. And I want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. This has been a difficult program. It's not easy to talk about this new Israeli government and some of the individuals that hold high positions and their ideology. But one thing we're reminded, that we need to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We need to pray for this Israeli government. We need to pray and stand with the Jewish people despite that, because God's given us this unconditional love for his people and his land. So thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.